All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Maria, and I'm one of the organizers with Uplift, which is a youth-led organization that connects, trains, and mobilizes young people across the Colorado Plateau and Greater Southwest to take action on climate justice. And this is the first in a series of webinars on white supremacy in environmentalism. And today's focus is on white supremacy and conservation. And we have three incredible panelists who will introduce themselves in just a moment, and a really wonderful facilitator, Amber, who will also introduce herself in a moment. And the first hour of tonight is going to be a panel facilitated by Amber with our three panelists. And then after the panel, we're encouraging that the folks in the group that are white identifying join us for a separate breakout session, which is going to be facilitated by me and my co-organizer Cam, who's also on the Zoom room. Cam, if you want to give a wave. We're encouraging white identifying folks to join us for a debrief and a white accountability space. And anyone is welcome to join us, but we are specifically encouraging white folks to join us there and to hold one another accountable in that space and to create some action steps for ourselves going forward. That will be a separate space, so the link to that Zoom room will be dropped in the chat as we end the first hour here with our panelists. And I think that is about it for introduction, so I will hand it over to Amber, our facilitator, who can help you get to know our panelists a little bit.
Great, thank you, Maria, and thank you to Uplift for inviting me to join as a facilitator or a moderator for this panel. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Amber Benali. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, occupied Dene, Hopi, Apache, and other territories. So that's just a brief introduction to myself. I'll be facilitating the questions and the Q&A questions that are put into the chat. I'll be asking your guest speakers of that question. So just again, thank you to Uplift. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. And I'm really excited to kick off this first of three webinar series. So with that, I will turn it over to Kelly Baker, who is one of our panelists.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly. I'm a past Uplift organizer, as well as an alum of the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program. A little bit about me. I love equity. I'm just trying to strive for climate justice in any and every aspect of my life. I'm also kind of a dork, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, so I'm really excited to chat with y'all today and have a nice conversation.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Talia, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, thank you. Yeah. She Talia Boyd and she Twitch eatni and Schlen Toy Haglini Bashichin Glasha Deshiche do Toba Deshanala not in Georgia Asia Hawan got out and net Schlen. My name is Talia Boyd. I'm born for the Bitterwater clan, born for water flows together. My maternal grandfather is Red Bottom. My paternal grandfather is Water's Edge. I'm based in Gallup, New Mexico, and I'm the Cultural Landscapes Program Manager for the Grand Canyon Trust. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Talia. And our last speaker is Wyatt.
Yat Anos Swashik Shidane Shizani Shikasi. This Kajik Ant Edanosinigi, Laganok Etcha Wyatt Wilson Dashijine, Shant Gohado I Yesi Det Nasha, Ado Kodo Kensamide Kesht, Twitch eating Slon, Adoma Ideshkini, Shitka, Nast Ejetka Bahan Edashiche, Ado Sitmajin Edashinadle. Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Wyatt Wilson. My family is originally from Shanto, Arizona, and I'm currently residing in Durango, Colorado. I'm a pre-law student majoring in political science at Fort Lewis College, and I was just an Uplift organizing fellow this past summer.
Great, thank you everyone for giving your introductions. For our audience, the way this is going to look is I'm going to ask each of our panelists one of 4 questions, and each panelist will get 3 to 4 minutes to answer the questions that we've put together. And the end of this will be followed by a Q&A session where the questions you ask of our panelists, I will present to them so they can answer as well. So to kick off the first question, and for our panelists, you can feel free to draw on your own experiences to answer these questions. And so our first question is, how do you see race dynamics play out in the conservation movement? And feel free to answer, whoever's willing to go first.
Sure, I can kick us off. It's a great question. Thank you, Amber. I first want us to recognize, and for the conservation movement to recognize that it has been built on privilege, power, and oppression. Because since its inception, it has recognized the land, but not the native peoples that come with the land. And so for that reason, it's been, it has excluded a lot of indigenous and non-white communities. And so that has been extended again to other marginalized groups. And that's why we have the conservation today being mostly predominantly white. You know, racism and white supremacy, again, have long excluded Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in environmental policy, conservation, and public health issues. And contrary to European colonizer discourse and American expansion discourse, our land was never empty space, right? It has always been our traditional homelands. For Native peoples, we have been here since the beginning, and that goes into our cosmologies and our epistemologies. And so we have deep-rooted regenerative relationships with the natural world. And that was, again, never recognized by the conservationists when they established this movement. And for Native peoples, we realized that that was a part of the white supremacy. It was a part of racism. And you see it play out again to this day in different ways. You know, everything from environmental protection policies or the standards for those environmental protections. Most of those standards are based off of white males, right? And they don't include non-white folks. You know, we also see it play out in public comment. You know, right now, Chaco, they're still moving forward with public comment, especially now during a time of COVID, during a global pandemic. And we all know that our tribal communities have been hit hard by this pandemic, yet these governmental entities are moving forward with public comment, knowing that our tribal communities do not have the capacities or the resources to go there and comment and be a part of that process. And so you see these, you see racism and white supremacy playing out in various ways, but those are some of the ways that I'd like to highlight. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic.
Great, thank you, Talia. And just a reminder for our speakers and our audience, the question is, how do you see race dynamics play out in the conservation movement?
I guess I can go next. So when talking about race dynamics playing out in conservation and the overall environmental justice movement, I think we also have to be critical of Uplift's past and understand that Uplift was a part of the Grand Canyon Trust, and through discourse with other BIPOC individuals, you know, we have to acknowledge really in a lot of ways violence that you know, the Grand Canyon Trust posed to you know, people that, you know, BIPOC people that worked for them, the BIPOC people that organized with them. And so just to say that bit, then when I think about race dynamics in conservation, I also think about, you know, my own start in, you know, climate advocacy work. And how really I was gatekept from a lot of this. You know, I attended, you know, growing up in Flagstaff, you know, it's a very, you know, progressive town in a lot of ways, but I didn't see people like me engaging in conservation work. I didn't see people back home, you know, even in my own tribal communities, knowing, you know, the policies that continue to disproportionately affect, you know, Black and Brown communities. Yeah.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Yeah, I mean, when thinking about this question, thought about a lot of things, thought about my personal experiences and also about the different, you know, facets within the conservation movement. So I kind of went back in my life to like academia, how I just sat there and listened all the time, even if I didn't agree with something, or I just felt like my voice wasn't valued whatsoever or asked upon. And I was just meant to sit here and listen. And almost like it was almost ingrained, I feel like, in my mind that that is what I had to do in order to be safe and not, yeah, just be in a position that was unsafe for me. So I would say like in academia, that was a really hard pill to swallow for me. And I didn't even learn about words such as environmental racism, redlining until my senior year of college. And I was angry. I was mad. I felt so unseen within my education process that I was like, you know what? Whatever. I'm just gonna go on my own and do this thing and tell people, teach people, you know, like we really need to be elevating this conversation in multiple different assets or aspects of the conservation movement. And I mean, you know, also reflected in maybe corporate settings, right? Like I often feel like I'm asked to set the table because they're like, wow, you're this great BIPOC leader within, you know, the conservation movement. And I'm there to be seen as a Black person, but not there to be asked about my experience and my knowledge. Like, wow, you're such a Black person. I'm like, I know that, you know? It's disheartening in places, but also within the grassroots movement, I feel like I found my voice in places like Uplift, where I was actually asked once in my life, what do you think? Like, what is your experience? And I was like, this is weird. They're asking me my experience. That's not what I'm used to. So yeah, I would say it's also different. And then in terms of our resources and how we engage everyone, I feel like it's also different, right? Like conservation can sometimes be seen as super elitist, but then, right, I lived in a place very close to Cancer Alley for the last 6 months, but you know, like environmental racism and environmental classism, like, right, the effects of environmental issues interconnected with social cultural complexities, you know, it's not elitist in the slightest. So yeah, those are just some of the frustrations that I have.
Thank you all. So all of our panelists, you all bring your own experiences that you grew up with in your different communities. And we grew up with either these told ideas of what conservation is, or we learn what conservation is through academia. So I want to pose the next question is, how does your community define and practice conservation?
I'll go ahead and jump in. For Native peoples, we have found effective holistic solutions, again, from generations of living with the natural world. And it's imbued in our traditional environmental knowledge and our overall lifeways. These traditional knowledge systems have been passed down through blood memory and oral history. The interconnectedness that we share between the land has never been teased apart and is still recognized today through our very identities and our languages and our ceremonies. We are the original stewards of Turtle Island. And this land is native land. It does not understand English. And so we still have our offerings and our prayers and our ceremonies. And this is how we connect ourselves with our traditional homelands. Again, it's very deep rooted. It comes from generations of living with the natural world. And our existence is our resistance. That's what a lot of Native people say, right? And it's because of that deep-rooted integration that we have with the natural world. How we practice conservation. I know a lot of Native peoples don't identify as conservationists. I don't identify as a conservationist. I identify as a Diné woman, and I do work for a conservation organization. And a part of my responsibility as a Native woman working for a conservation organization is calling them out on these things, right? And putting it on the table and having these hard conversations internally and externally. And it's not easy, it's exhausting, because you have to be that bridge. You have to authentically represent your community, and you also have to authentically represent this organization, right? So it's a lot of translation. It's a lot of, a lot of translation, and it gets very exhausting. But that's just some of the complexities and dynamics that we see, as BIPOC folks working within the conservation movement. And so, I think for tribal communities, this is something that has always been practiced. Again, we've never teased ourselves away from the natural world and our responsibilities to the natural world. And so that's, again, I always say, like, it's that way of thinking. For Native peoples, we think in that nonlinear way, whereas non-Native peoples in that Western thought think in that very linear way. And so there's a lot of, divisiveness that comes out of that in that way of thinking. And so I'll go ahead and stop there, but I really wanted to just highlight how our tribal communities have really specific distinctions when it comes to being the stewards of our homelands. I'll go ahead and pass the mic.
Great, thank you, Talia. Wyatt or Kelly?
I can go ahead and chime in. I think from my perspective and from the perspective of my community, definitely echoing everything that Talia just said, that when I talk about, conservation and my own start, it wasn't, everything that I do is with the backing of my community. So yes, we talk about, stewardship and things like that. I learned about stewardship from my grandma and how she took care of her lands. And when we talk about, environmental justice, I think back to the elders and to the people in my own community that were disproportionately affected by uranium mining. So everything that, I am is, a reflection of my community. And I don't think that intrinsic, that spiritual connection is recognized within conservation and mainstream conservation discourse. Indigenous peoples have cared for and sustained this land for nearly since time memoriam, and in the 500 years since colonialism. We see the effects of capitalism and colonialism, and we are on the brink of climate disaster. And so I think in order for us to have meaningful, meaningful work and conversation, around conservation work, it has to be rooted in the decolonial land return to Indigenous peoples, to the rightful stewards of these lands. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go next. The last one. But yeah, from my perspective, well, one, I just have to say I'm so honored to be on this call right now, listening to you all. It's just amazing, and you're amazing. So I just wanted to state that. From my perspective, conservation is about assessing how we can create resiliency from within our ecosystems or communities. So, right, consistently pushing for just treatment of the holistic system. So I feel like, especially in the nonprofit community, when thinking about specifically environmental conservation, we focus on wicked problems, climate change, biodiversity. We think of it almost in like, let's say we, but in like a just very narrow focused mindset, and that's just not it. We really have to look at the the systems of oppression in place that perpetuates all of these issues, and then, you know, actively dismantle them, right? Like, we can't sit here and say, wow, like, this is all our fault, because it's not. And even in the terms of conservation, I'm like, what, when I think of conservation, I'm like, well, what needs to be conserved? Really, systems of power needs to change. That's just something that I was thinking through while coming across this question. Yeah, so I believe that conservation is practiced by actively moving towards this. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you, all three of you. The next question is along the lines of community again, and it's, you know, you all joined environmental justice for your own reasons, whatever that may be. And so the question is, in your opinion, why was there limited interest in joining the mainstream conservation movement from your family and or community?
Yeah, well, I think I touched on it a little earlier as far as the conservation movement and not acknowledging Native peoples and our tribal communities, and disregarding our relationships with the natural world. That created division and it created mistrust. And so, you know, Native peoples were like, okay, well, these folks don't want to be inclusive. And so it was years, decades of that. And then there's a deep trauma of land loss that exists within tribal communities. It hits deep for all tribal communities. And the conservation movement in its own ways plays into perpetuating environmental racism by not acknowledging how it does play into the dispossession of ancestral homelands to Native peoples, right? So, and for instance, you know, Native Indigenous communities were often on the front lines of defending our territories, our sacred landscapes, our resources, and our rights from extractive projects and outside and corporate interests. And, you know, we deal with entities like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who manages energy development. This is just an example of 55 million surface acres held in trust or restricted status for tribes and their members, but they're notorious for having issues with oversight and collaborating with stakeholders. And our tribes get lumped into stakeholder categories all the time. We're not stakeholders, we're sovereign nations. There are also issues with workforce planning, equipment, infrastructure, and data use, right? So these are some of the issues that our tribal communities deal with when working with not only governmental entities, but NGOs and other conservation organizations within the movement, right? And so there needs to be some authentic rapport building between these entities, whether they be governmental or not, when they want to work with tribal communities, that, you know, it has to come from a place of authenticity and really acknowledging that they have a lot of work to do when it comes to rebuilding that trust with us. And so for our tribal communities, there still is that hesitancy to engage because of those reasons. And I think our tribal communities won't feel fully included or will want to be included until that acknowledgement happens across the board within the conservation movement, right? And when the conservation movement acknowledges there is a lot of intersectionality that needs to happen because we've been so siloed for so long, right? That's why we have different movements. We have environmental justice, we have social justice, economic justice, but these are all very much, they should be very much together, and we should be working together, right? Collaboratively across the board. And so again, I think it really, for Native peoples, we know these things. We know that all these movements they should be working together. And I think this is a part of that. The challenge when working and trying to build those bridges is that a lot of times we don't recognize that, and that, you know, there's still a lot of hard conversations, like I said, that need to happen. There's still a lot of hard work, and especially for our white allies, right? I think there's a lot of there's a lot of trauma that exists within white America. And I think until they realize that and recognize that for themselves, then that's the only time that they can do their own deep healing, and look at it, look at that ugly history, and really try to, you know, start healing and building relationships with the ancestors, with their own ancestors, but with also the people that they have colonized and oppressed for so long. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen across the board. But I think the real work starts with our conservationists, right? The folks who identify as conservationists, they have to dig deep and they have to acknowledge that there's a dark history. There's a lot of nuances that have played out, and there's still a lot of, again, real acknowledgement that needs to happen.
Great, thank you, Talia. Wyatt or Kelly?
I can go. Yeah. Yeah. So for my family, I remember talking to my family when I was around 15 or 16 about really wanting to join this movement, and why I was so passionate about it. And in the beginning, they really didn't understand, right? So they didn't understand, right, what sustainability was, what conservation is. And then also I had this talk with my mom, because she's from Southern Alabama. She grew up there right in the 60s. So she's like, we've had this conversation many times, but we would have this running joke in our family, right? Black people don't camp. And we would just be like, ha ha ha, Black people don't camp. What do you mean? And it actually dates back to, right, civil rights era before then, when Black people would go into predominantly white green spaces. That would then be a space in which could be potentially dangerous, right? Lynchings was something that was so widespread and normalized that my entire immediate family just had this notion of, we don't camp because that's dangerous for us. And we as a Black family going out into a space that is predominantly white could possibly mean imminent danger for us. And so when she was talking to me about that, that just rung a bell, because my whole family is like that, you know? They're like, we don't snow, like, or we don't we don't ski, we don't camp. And it's not we don't because we're Black, it's because we don't feel safe in any of those spaces. And we don't feel like those recreational, which aren't, but spaces were created for anyone like that, us, just created for rich white people. Yeah, I mean, listening to that made me really sad, because growing up, I felt like I didn't have that huge connection with nature that I wanted, but it was because our family was just often in fear of it. And then living in a predominantly white part of town as well. And then, you know, coming to terms with George Floyd's death, and right, like Black Lives Matter movement just pushing forward and getting a lot of resistance governmentally. You know, my brother, this is kind of long-winded, but my brother has autism, and he has honestly come so far, and his like sigh of relief is when he goes on walks every day. And there was a point in time this summer where he was like, I can't go on walks because I don't know if someone's gonna look at me and think that, you know, I don't have to explain that. So, I mean, that right there just kind of denotes just a lot of the hurt, the pain of white supremacy permeated in this.
Before I give my answer, I just want to say, you know, thank you to Kelly for being so open and honest with all of us today. When when we talk about mainstream environmental discourse and the conservation of so-called wilderness spaces, I think we have to acknowledge that all of that is rooted in the displacing and the removal of Indigenous peoples and the exclusion of Black communities. First and foremost, a lot of the work that I engage in outside of environmental justice is also about college access, and specifically college access within tribal communities. And when I saw this question, I saw a lot of connections that can be drawn between both of them. Within the realm of college access, we talk about barriers to entry. And so when I talk about barriers, when I think of barriers to entry in conservation work, I think about the lack of political education within Black and Brown communities. When I think of barriers to entry in conservation, I think about the lack of resources available to Black and Brown communities when Black and Brown communities are being disproportionately affected by, these environmental atrocities. So when I think of my own family and I think of my own community, I wasn't raised in a family that centered these conversations. I was raised in a family that was heavily affected by uranium mining on the Navajo Nation. I lost my own mother. And so when I think back on, how I got my start into this work, it was really on my own. It was really, it was really, like, I felt like I had to forge my own way. I felt like I had to go out and seek these resources for myself. And when talking with other, Diné folks and other Native folks, there's so many similarities. And I don't think it should be that way. I think that that Native peoples and BIPOC individuals have to be at the forefront of conservation work. Because if not, then what are we doing all of this for? Yeah.
Thank you all. I just want to echo Wyatt and give thanks to all of our speakers for being in a space of vulnerability. These are really deep questions, but they're questions that need to be asked so that we're, educating the masses on what we think conservation is and what it should look like. So the next question really gets at the meat of this idea of white supremacy in conservation, whiteness and conservation. And the question is, how does current language used in conservation spaces continuously perpetuate white supremacy?
Yeah, this is a good question. Thank you. And I just got done organizing a teach-in series called Native Perspectives on Public Lands and Tribal Preservation. And one of them was, how do you visit with respect on ancestral land, right? And so one of my panelists, her name is Adesba Foguth, she's Native and she works as a National Park Service employee. And so, and she's, she comes across all of these different terms within her work, specifically words like contact, abandoned, ruins, and, it really started to bug her and it had a lot of negative connotation connected to it. But firstly, I think a lot of colonial views frame nature as something to be conquered and exploited for resources, right? And so that definitely perpetuates it. And then going back to those terms like abandoned or ruined, when we're talking about some of our ancestral homelands, she mentioned how words have meaning. And the way we talk about something is the way we think about them. And the way we think about them directly informs how we act and the way that we make decisions about them, right? So she talked about how when we use words like ruins or abandon, like take abandon, for instance, like what words come up in your mind when you think of abandon? It's something that's, somebody left and that they're never coming back to for all time, right? And so, we in a Western lens, you know, these places are living spaces for Native peoples. And so they have never been abandoned, and we still go there and we offer prayers and offerings. And the fact that they're not, you know, that we're not living there does not mean that they are abandoned. And I think this is what our non-Native relatives don't understand. And so that has, again, negative connotations, right? Because when folks think of a place as an abandoned place, they think they can go in there and treat it however they want, right? And do whatever they want. And that's exactly what was happening and is happening in, for instance, in Chaco. And she mentioned how folks would go in there and climb in and sleep in the kivas and climb all over the walls, right? And do just these crazy things, basically desecrating the sacred landscape. Because of these terms that they've heard while learning about these places, right? And then talking about ruins, like what do you think about when you hear the word ruins, right? Like, so she talked about all of these different terms that you hear within the conservation realm, and how it negatively impacts, you know, and how it creates this negative narrative around how we should be and visiting these spaces, but also thinking and you know, making decisions about them and how we further educate our communities and our families and our friends around these issues, right? There's another term too, like wild and wilderness, right? So that also has been has a negative connotation now too through the Western lens. You know, it's seen as something to be avoided or transformed into like worked land, like agriculture. Or, you know, into some tidy European manicured garden, right? And that just is, you know, there's this historian, and this is also one of my colleagues shared this, Roderick Nash, who wrote, it is Western civilization invented wilderness. It is a Judeo-Christian Anglo-European thought that divides the world into binary categories of wild and tamed, natural and cultivated, right? And so it really shows you that other way of thinking, that Western way of thinking, that white man way of thinking. You know, and I also wanted to highlight how there's a lot of policies that are still in place that perpetuate white supremacy and that uphold systemic racism, right? And that's the doctrine of discovery, right? That's used to this day to dispossess ancestral homeland from Native peoples. And then the manifest destiny, right? Which the doctrine was a precursor of the manifest destiny. So all of these different things have definitely played into how white supremacy continues to be perpetuated, not only within the conservation movement, but across all of our movements, because it's that deeply embedded, right? And folks, and now it's been so normalized, which is the scariest part. You know, and again, it goes back to planting seeds and having hard conversations and really confronting it in any way you can.
Great, thank you, Talia. Follow up from Wyatt or Kelly?
Yeah, I can go next. So recently, I've read this document called White Supremacy Culture by Kenneth Jones and Tema Ukun. So after reading this, I had a bunch of light bulbs kind of go off. I was like, oh, wow. These were characteristics of white supremacy that I didn't even know, even though I felt like I knew exactly, right? White supremacy is this. But in terms of actions and characteristics that follow, it definitely, yeah, it just made me a bit more aware. And also I felt like a lot of my anxieties were seen within this. So I wanted to quickly just give 3 of these characteristics and then talk a little more about them. So 1 is sense of urgency. So this is a continued sense of urgency that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive, encourage democratic and or thoughtful decision making, to think long term, to consider consequences, frequently results in sacrificial potential allies for quick or high visible results, for example, sacrificing, interests of communities of color in order to win victories for white people seen as default or norm community. Objectivity, the belief that there is such a thing as being objective, the belief that emotions are inherently destructive, irrational, and should not play a role in decision-making or group process. Invalidating people who show emotion, requiring people to think a linear fashion and ignoring or invalidating those who think other ways, are impatient, or the impatience with any thinking that does not appear to those with power. And then either or thinking things are either or, good or bad, right or wrong, or with us and against us. It's closely linked to perfectionism and making it difficult to learn from mistakes or accommodate conflict, no sense that things can be both, and results in trying to simplify complex things, for example, believing that poverty is simply a result of lack of education. So these characteristics really popped out to me, and I feel like I've seen them perpetuated within the conservation movement in certain aspects. Specifically, I would say in the nonprofit lens. So that just kind of, right, made me feel a little seen in that way. And this document is amazing because it provides different antidotes as well. And maybe we could provide that as a resource after, but I just wanted to talk a little more about it because I feel like when I saw this question, I was like, well, what is white supremacy? Yeah, that's it.
So when this question was posed, I immediately thought back to my childhood. I thought back to, my elementary school field trips to Wapaki National Monument, to the Grand Canyon. And I remember, thinking back and reading these brochures and how, yes, they mentioned, the Native peoples that lived and sustained these places, but it was always talked about in the past tense. That I feel like when we talk about so-called wilderness spaces, when we talk about national parks, we have to first acknowledge that Native communities, while they might not presently occupy these lands, that they have histories and oral histories and blood memory of these spaces. And then furthermore, a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that I do in academia is centered around just transition, this concept of moving from, an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And when thinking about this, I thought back to a lot of, nonprofit orgs that, I've worked with in the past and how they commodify and Native voices. When we say land back, when we say the decolonial land return to Indigenous peoples, we're given token land acknowledgements, we're given corny t-shirts when, land back is a practice, is actively working towards giving, autonomy back to Native peoples. And just to go off of what Kelly was talking about, nonprofits, a lot of the work that I do in Just Transition, I feel like Just Transition is really weaponized by nonprofits against, Black and brown communities, that in order for these entities, these organizations, to be committed to a just transition, they must be committed to a future where they no longer exist. They must be committed to a future where they no longer commodify Indigenous voices. They must be committed to a future that does not include them. And I think that has to be at the forefront of these conversations.
Yeah, that's right on. I just want to echo what Wyatt was saying. Like, there has to be, it's about losing some of that power, right? And I think that's that scares the hell out of white people. They don't want to lose that power, and that's it's a huge conversation. I mean, it really, and it boils down to that. And again, kind of going back into questioning their own healing and the atrocities that their ancestors have done across our homelands and across the world, right? So it's you know, I say, like, they colonized themselves and then they colonized the rest of us. So there's a lot of deep healing that needs to happen within white folks. You know, there's a lot of acknowledgement that goes into their own traumas. And I think until they recognize that, again, we can't really talk about this in an authentic way and build those bridges, because it's like talking to somebody who hasn't understood how hurt they are, right? And how to address that. And so I just wanted to add that really quickly. Thank you.
Great, thanks all of you. We have about 9 minutes left in this panel discussion before we move out into the workshop session, but I just want to read a few questions that we got in the Q&A segment. The first one I think is important. The question is, how does education of the youth play into white supremacy and settler colonialism? Is this where change can be made? An example of that is like the history books that children are exposed to. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back into that systemic racism, right? And how it's definitely in all of our institutions across the board, especially our educational school systems. Yeah, American history textbooks are bogus. They don't teach the real history. If you want to learn about real so-called American history, go to Bears Ears. Check out the rock history that is written on the rocks. You know, those are real lived experiences, and that's where you can learn the most about what this land and our peoples have put on the table for the rest of us. Again, we have generations of knowledge of living with this land. And so we need to be a part of all of these conversations across the board. And we have to really stand back and look at what we're being taught, how we've been conditioned for so long, how we've been put into a little box to think in one way, as opposed to celebrating all of our cultures and all of our beautiful ways of knowing and expressing ourselves and gathering information and sharing information. It's about including all of that, right? And that's that inclusivity and equity. And so, yeah, it goes back into that. We got to call out our education systems. We got to call out all of our institutions. You know, it's a lot of, again, hard conversations, and they're not pretty. You got to have really thick skin to do the work. And I really admire all the young people who are really stepping up, and in a lot of ways schooling, you know, some of us older folks on what it takes and what we need to do to really do this in a good way. So I'll share that much. Thank you.
If I could quickly add to this, echoing definitely everything that Talia has put forth, but also plugging, Uplift Climate and the work that we're engaging in. As mentioned before this started, Uplift is really, one of the few orgs here, at least in the Southwest, that is engaging youth in these conversations and teaching one another and learning from one another, building community and building struggle. So yeah. And just another thing, when we talk about teaching these things and, these atrocities, I also want to encourage people to, as much as you want to teach about the traumatic events that happened, teach about Black people winning, teach about Indigenous people winning, center these conversations as much as you center the trauma. Yeah.
Any thoughts from Kelly?
Yeah, I definitely echo everything that Talia and oh my gosh, Wyatt, I'm sorry. Everything that Talia and Wyatt has said so far. I mean, yeah, I think it would be astronomical, starting with textbooks, but not only there, I also feel like we should talk about healing, right? When we talk about these events, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but in history class, whenever it would get to like the racism or civil rights movement sector, everyone would just look at me and be like, and I just think that we really need to kind of like elevate those conversations about race, about ethnicity in schools. Like I just remember being so triggered, and now talking to people that may have triggered me in high school or college, and they're like, I am so sorry. I didn't realize what I had said. I didn't realize, the racist undertones of what I was saying to you. That was definitely hurtful, but now I do, and I'm so sorry. So it's like, what would happen if that was taught the same time that these different events in history were also taught, as well as victories and like I started learning also about, right, different cultures and their different what is it called, attachments and history of the land, right? Like I've just started to go back into my ancestry from, and ancestry.com, because I didn't know where I came from before. And having those conversations in school, we're like, where are you from? And I'm like, yeah, I don't really know past my great grandmother. Things like that. We really need to elevate those conversations and make sure that BIPOC youth are elevated and not expected to just be okay when these triggery things happen.
And just to quickly add to that, like if you're a white person, in a position of privilege, whether you have intergenerational wealth or whatever, like pay Black and brown individuals for the knowledge that they're giving you. Yeah.
Yeah, also to echo on that, I've had people come up to me and say, what's the difference between racism or race and ethnicity? And what is racism? Like, always try to do your research before you ask, and also ask for consent whenever you are asking someone about their experience.
Great. Thank you all. I just want to again extend a thank you to Talia, Wyatt, and Kelly for sharing your thoughts with us, and to Uplift for facilitating these hard to have conversations and presenting that to people who have joined us. And I'm going to invite Maria back to talk next steps. But again, thank you, Uplift, for inviting me, and thank you to the speakers for sharing your knowledge and your thoughts with us today.